Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by a return guest, Dr. Eleanor Scerri. She is professor at the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology. And today we're going to talk about Homo sapiens in Saudi Arabia, their spread through wet tropical forests in Africa, and also their presence on Malta. So, Dr. Sherry, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be back.
Okay, so toward the end of our last conversation, we touched a little bit on the topic of Homo sapiens in Saudi Arabia, but today I would like to get deeper into it. So, do we know when they first got there?
We assume that Homo sapiens was probably able to get into Western Asia several times before the main dispersal event from which all non Africans are descended. So it's likely that every time the deserts shrank, so by the deserts I mean the Sahara Arabian arid belt, which stretches across North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula, or every time there was an interglacial period, the period between ice ages, and we see increased rainfall, it's likely that to varying degrees this desert belt shrank, allowing humans to be able to leave Africa. And the earliest of these dispersals likely to have happened could have been as old as 280,000 years ago. And we know this because we find that the mitochondrial genome of Neanderthal populations was replaced by something on the Homo sapiens lineage. And because of the position of the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, sort of halfway across that barrier, people either go northwards to a Levantine corridor, or they go slightly further to the south. That's going to take them into the Arabian Peninsula. It's likely that humans got into the Arabian Peninsula and Saudi Arabia, northern Saudi Arabia, multiple times. The earliest definite evidence, of course, requires fossil remains. And in fact, we do have fossil remains from Saudi Arabia dating to between about 85 and 90,000 years ago in the form of a finger bone. But it's likely that Homo sapiens dispersed into Arabia before this time, but we don't have fossils, which are, of course, much harder to find.
Right. And do we know if there had been other Homo species in Saudi Arabia before Homo sapiens?
Absolutely. So in Saudi Arabia, we have lower Paleolithic, middle Paleolithic, and upper Paleolithic artifacts that suggests that other forms of human before Homo sapiens were present there. There are many sites that feature Acheulean hand axes, bifaces, that go back into various interglacial periods before the stage 5 interglacial, where humans like us were likely present. And so it seems likely that Saudi Arabia was this sort of intercontinental nexus of human and hominin dispersals. And people may have been, or hominin ancestors really may have been going in there, not just from Africa, but from other regions of Europe and Asia as well. So we looked at a site called the Wadmi, for example, in Saudi Arabia, where we could see that there were actually pre-Homo sapiens hominins there that were producing hand axes that were sort of quite rough looking, but actually this site ended up being like fairly young lower Paleolithic site, whereas other locations in Saudi Arabia had much more refined looking hand axes that turned out to be a little older. So we also have to be careful how we quantify the capabilities of these earlier hominins, because they don't seem to follow the sort of maybe linear trajectory that we might expect. But what we can see is that, Saudi Arabia was an important peripheral region between persistently habitable core areas that are refugia. So, for example, in the Levant, there are areas that are persistently habitable through periods of environmental downturn, and we know we have continuous human habitation in these regions going back from the lower Paleolithic onwards. whereas places like Saudi Arabia would not have been continuously habitable, but they're like gateways between those habitable regions. So during periods of environmental downturn, we see populations collapsing back into the core areas that are persistently habitable, and they stay there until there's periods of environmental amelioration, where places like Saudi Arabia open up and connect the persistently habitable cores that are spread across different regions of both Africa and Eurasia. So this is why areas like Saudi Arabia are really important.
Do we know how and why did Homo sapiens get to Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, we know, for example, that 130,000 years ago, which is the last period known as the last interglacial, that there was a significant increase in rainfall, even for an interglacial period, across the Saudi Arabian, or the Arabian Desert Belt, as well as North Africa. So, for example, North Africa, we have this huge shrinkage of the Sahara Desert, and similarly, we see a massive shrinking of deserts in the Arabian Peninsula and the expansion of grasslands and savanna type environments. And we know that just further north to the Arabian Peninsula in present day Israel and Lebanon, Syria, we see an early presence of Homo sapiens during this period, that's suggesting that people are getting out of Africa during this time. And we see very similar stone tools in the Arabian Peninsula. So we don't have the fossils 130,000 years ago, but we do have very similar stone tools. And similarly, later on in time, in Saudi Arabia, there are also tools that look very similar to the kinds of tools we find at Neanderthal sites in the Levant as well. So we don't have the fossils, so it's very difficult to say exactly what's going on. But it's likely that we don't just have the ancestors of Homo sapiens in Saudi Arabia. It's likely that we also have our evolutionary cousins present just, a few kilometers further south to where we know they were in the Levant.
How was the climate and the environment when Homo sapiens first arrived in Saudi Arabia? Was it very different from what it is now?
Yes, so obviously at the moment this region is characterized by a hyper-arid desert. And yet we know that it wasn't always this way. So, we've been walking in the Saudi Arabian desert doing field work, looking at the remains of lakes. So you can imagine walking through hyper-arid desert with huge hills of dunes, almost feel like mountains. And then you find the remains of a lake, an interdunal lake, and you find the bones of elephants and hippos and other savanna animals that are obligate drinkers. And from this kind of data, the presence of lakes and these animals right in the midst of what is today a hyper-arid desert, we can piece together a story of extreme climate change. And we can see that what is today desert has really oscillated between desert and grassland in the past. And this has been sort of dubbed a green Arabia. And so during various wetter periods in the past, usually relating to interglacial periods, we see Mediterranean westerlies and the East African monsoon clipping into the Arabian Peninsula and causing periods of increased rainfall, which turn the hyper-arid deserts into savanna-type environments. So very, very different to what we see today. And it's also very interesting to find animals like hippos, because to disperse, hippos require continuous bodies of water. And so this speaks to these wet corridors that link Africa right into the heart of hyper-arid deserts in the Arabian Peninsula today. And of course, if hippos are able to disperse out of Africa using continuous waterways, and many other animals, including humans, are also able to do so.
Where exactly in Saudi Arabia did they first arrive? I mean, where in the peninsula?
Yeah, so when we talk about dispersal into the Arabian Peninsula, we usually talk about two routes. So the northern route goes through the Sinai and into northern Arabia and then southwards. And the southern route crosses what's known as the Bab al-Mandab, which is the southern region that connects the Horn of Africa to what is today Yemen in southern Arabia. And so there have been many debates about which route was preferred. The southern route would have required some kind of water crossing, unless we're looking at a hyper-arid region where we see water level decreasing, but that also makes it less likely for humans to have been able to cross during this period. So it has been more instructive for us to look further north and try to understand what continuous water bodies may have allowed humans to be able to get into Arabia via this northern route. And in fact, we have found continuous bodies of water that would have existed during interglacial periods that would have connected northeastern Africa via the Sinai Peninsula and then down into northern Saudi Arabia, and then would have allowed them to probably follow a route across the highlands in the western half of the Arabian Peninsula right down into the south, where of course you get into very different ecozones down there as well, where even today you have like cloud forest in southern Arabian Peninsula. So it actually ends up being quite a diverse environment once you're able to get in there.
And how did they then disperse across Saudi Arabia?
Saudi Arabia had a number of lakes and rivers that would have been activated during these periods of increased rainfall. And a lot of these rivers, which today are referred to as wadis, so these river valleys that are now often dry, some of them are seasonally active, would have formed rivers that connected west to east pretty much across the Arabian Peninsula, would have allowed people to disperse across this region and potentially even cross out of the Arabian Peninsula, going further to the east and then taking you into the Zagros mountain regions of what is today Iran. So there were many possible dispersal routes because these rivers and lakes crisscross different regions of the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, you also have the highland regions to the west that have their own microclimates. And in an area the size of the Nefer Desert, which is fairly large, we've uncovered evidence for like thousands and thousands of lakes. Mm-hmm. And so it gives you an idea of how interconnected these regions may have been. So it's a completely different world to what we can imagine today.
You mentioned the Nefer Desert. Why is it so important in this part of human history?
I mean, the Food Desert is in northern Saudi Arabia, and of course, if you're looking at northern routes, it's sort of the area that people would have encountered when they would have been migrating towards the Arabian Peninsula. And of course, if they are crossing during a time that's fairly arid, then we would have expected the Nefud to have been a barrier towards human expansion. But if they cross during interglacial periods, which is probably the most representative time of human crossing, even though we think this was fairly arid about 50,000 years ago and the sort of main out of Africa that happened. It's important because when it was wetter, then this is an area that would have been very habitable. It wouldn't have represented a radically different environment to the grasslands and savannas of the northeastern regions of Africa. So in many ways, it would have been a fairly familiar environment that would have been gentle on human expansions, which can be contrasted to moving into Palearctic zones further to the north, which would have been an environment that would have been completely new. So the sort of Mediterranean oak forests of the Levant would have been like quite a different environment with different animals. And of course, we know, thanks to all these lakes, that this was also an environment that was very amenable to humans, because we know that every time we have identified a lake and we've gone to check it out on the ground, we always find archaeology associated with these lakes. So they have always been magnets for humans whenever they have existed.
Did Homo sapiens have an impact on the landscape and climate of Saudi Arabia when they were there?
I think that's quite difficult to quantify at the moment. I mean, their impact on the landscape, it would have been similar to what we see in North Africa, where certain sites you have so much human material culture waste that they actually sort of modify the environment in some way. So there are certain parts of the Arabian Peninsula, certain sites where you're walking on piles of cores and flakes and hand axes that form these, I guess, significant human modified environment. But I don't know that they would have had a significant environmental impact at that time, but almost certainly successive waves of humans and hominins in these areas would have been aware that they were not the first person to inhabit these environments, just because it's not possible to even walk through some of them without having to step on the material culture remains of the humans and the hominins that came before to an impressive degree, where you literally, as far as the eye can see, you just have piles and piles of stone tools in that landscape.
Right. Okay, so just to close off this section on Saudi Arabia, I'm not sure if this is a topic that you specifically study, but do we also know where did Homo sapiens spread out of Saudi Arabia?
And I'm sure that humans spread out of Saudi Arabia. I think there's good evidence that they spread across that entire region of Southwest Asia, and it looks like they even went further east. I think that the question is more, why were these earlier dispersals not as successful as later ones? It's a bit of a mystery, because they did manage to move into some new environments and exploit them, at least for a while. Obviously, climate would have played some part in that story. It is a region that when it gets arid, it gets very, very arid and over very, very wide regions. So managing to move out of them fast enough during periods of rapid aridification would have been like a problem for humans. But almost certainly, when you did have these linked hydrological networks across these previously uninhabited area, when they greened, they provided incredible new opportunities for hominins and other animals. So you can imagine, suddenly you have these vast new areas full of animals that you could exploit, that you could gather plants and fruits from, that wouldn't have been open to humans before. So they were huge new areas of opportunity. And while they provided those opportunities, they were also would have fostered population increases, at least temporarily. And if you have population increase, then you have expansion. So for several millennia, we probably did have a situation where people expanded into and out of the Arabian Peninsula. But of course, then with periods of downturn, then we're probably also looking at population collapses and local extinctions as well.
Mm-hmm. So, in our previous conversation, we talked a lot about the diverse environments that Homo sapiens spread through and lived in our early evolutionary history. What about wet tropical forests in Africa? Did we live in that habitat type? And what role did tropical forests play in our evolution?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question. It's not it's not an easy one to answer, because it's actually quite a new perspective on human evolution and the deep human past. So when we are looking at our own species, Homo sapiens, we've typically privileged really one type of environment, these sort of open grassland and savanna environments. And these have really been thought of as a sort of an ecological cradle for our species for a long time. And conversely, dense rainforests have been thought of as barriers to human expansion for a really long time. And, if we go back to the previous generations of scholars, there were these quite strong arguments that humans couldn't have inhabited rainforests until the advent of farming, and drawing on the fact that modern forest forager communities often engage in food and labor exchange practices with farmers. And for a long time, it was thought that somehow some degree of farming was required for people to have been able to survive in these environments, which are considered marginal to human habitation. Why? Because you have a sparse distribution of carbohydrates and fats. Rainforest soils are not particularly productive. And obviously, it's a very dense, tangled environment. The fauna are cryptic. You can't see the animals you want to hunt, and you can't see if maybe an animal is hunting you very easily, compared to being able to stand up in these wide vistas of savanna environments. So this whole idea that the biological range of tolerances that humans started off with before we really advanced our material culture to be able to expand those niches has been a savanna, and this has really dominated inquiry. But that started to shift a little bit for two reasons. So first of all, there's been a lot of work that has shown that our modernity, like our behavioral modernity, does go right back to the inception of our species, and that before we left Africa, there's abundant evidence of humans behaving in the way humans do. So modern behavior, symbolic behavior, complex culture. And of course, that sort of raises this idea, like, if we're already fully Homo sapiens, are we really still trapped by one single ecosystem? That doesn't sound like a very human thing, Could we really not have overcome this for like millennia? And then, of course, when we started to shift our ideas about where humans come from in Africa and shift from this idea of a single birthplace to multiple human roots in multiple different regions, and the question becomes one of, do we originate from contiguous areas of savanna and grasslands in Africa? So are we looking at an extended ecological cradle? Because, these environments are found across much of Africa. Or are we looking, does this model imply different ecosystems as well? And that sort of hasn't been clear. And one way to sort of try to test that hypothesis is to go to very different regions of Africa that are off the sort of map of human origins, like West Africa, and to start investigating in probably the most radically different environment to a grassland is of course a rainforest. Grasslands are open and dry, rainforests are closed and wet, very different animals, very different plants, and to try to see whether humans have been living there. And we're not the first people to ask this question. People have been trying to answer it for a long time, but it's a very challenging place to work, not least for geopolitical reasons. A lot of areas of present-day rainforest in Africa are going through considerable political problems and uncertainties, and not always safe places to work in. And also, preservation conditions are extremely difficult. It is a very different area to, for example, an open area of tectonic uplift with good soil preservation conditions for fossils like you find in East Africa. But of course, we have to be careful that, we are looking at differential preservation conditions here. We're not, it's not necessarily that humans come from the places you find their fossils in. That's just an outcome of preservation. And rainforest, we know, does not have good preservation. And to make things even more complicated, African rainforests are at the cusp of what's possible for rainforests for the amount of sort of rainfall that Africa gets. So rainforests in South America, for example, or in Asia, get much more rainfall than African rainforests do. So even a small drop in rainfall in Africa will fragment rainforests. So if you find an archaeological site in a rainforest today, it doesn't mean it was rainforest in the past. You have to prove that. But I think the combination of questioning a single origin in Africa hypothesis for our species happening at the same time that rainforest habitation in Southeast Asia was being pushed back to the Pleistocene, all of a sudden, why not Africa? And I think, it allowed us to sort of ask that question in a way that maybe that there was more fuel to the fire of trying to answer that question. And so it was with that in mind that, we went back to a site that had already been discovered by a previous team in the Ivory Coast. It was discovered by an Ivorian colleague, Professor Gede, when he was a PhD student back in the 1980s. And he was a PhD student in what was then the Soviet Union. and he invited a Soviet team to come to the Ivory Coast to work with him on this site that he had discovered on the banks of the Bete River in the southern Ivory Coast, which he didn't know at the time, but we knew from later on, according to climate models, this looked like it had been continuously an area of rainforest refugia, even during periods of rainforest fragmentation. And the site that they found was very interesting because it was a very deeply stratified site, which is unusual for this part of the world. And it was really very well investigated by this joint Ivorian Soviet mission, not least because Professor Gede was a very good lithic analyst. There were other very good lithic analysts on the site, and also a team of stratigraphers and geologists. They didn't have the same scientific arsenal for dating that we had available to us, but they could see that there were periods of heavy soil formation, which spoke to wetter conditions, that were also associated with the stone tools, which of course they couldn't date. So what we did is we went back to the same site. We could verify that their interpretation of the stratigraphy was really good. So, we didn't have to reevaluate anything there. But what we could do was to go back and not just date the layers that they had uncovered associated with the stone tools, but also for the most dense layers of artifacts, we could recover botanical information. And this is what we did. So we went back to the site and we dated it, and we showed that dates from just above the deepest archaeological layers dated to about 150,000 years ago, which is a very interesting time period because it is Middle Pleistocene, but it's a late Middle Pleistocene date in which we know that Homo sapiens were the only hominins, as far as we know, around in Africa at that time. And then when we looked at the botanical information, we looked at leaf wax isotopes, we looked at phytolith remains, which are silicified remains of plants, and we also looked at pollen. Using these three different independent proxies, we were able to show that this is a sort of a seasonally inundated wet tropical forest, which is a very fancy scientific way of saying it's a rainforest, a lowland rainforest that's seasonally inundated. So it's an extremely different environment, and humans were living in this environment 150,000 years ago, which is an extremely obviously fascinating insight that this is not East Africa, it's West Africa, it's the Middle Pleistocene, it's not an open environment, it's an environment that's supposedly hostile to humans, and yet here they are living in these environments. And the question to me is, should we really be that surprised that they are there, knowing what we know about human capabilities?
So what you mentioned there, was it what you studied in your recently published paper on humans in Africa's wet tropical forests 150,000 years ago? Is that it? Or if not, what did you study there exactly?
Yeah, so I'm referring to our work which we published this year in Nature, where we went back to this site, Anyama, and the southern Ivory Coast, where we essentially, with Professor Gede, finished a project that he had started back in the 1980s, and we were finally able to add detail to those discoveries through paleobotanical work and two different types of dating for those stone tools found at the site, which it's a really incredible story. It's such a long analysis. Obviously, there was a long hiatus in between, but Professor Gede, now in his 80s, I think it's fantastic for him that the site that he discovered all the way back in the late 70s ended up being one of the most important sites in Africa for understanding human evolution.
So what does the fact that we lived across a diversity of environments and we evolved there as Homo sapiens, what does that tell us about our evolution in contrast with that more, I don't know, I would call it traditional view of humans having evolved in one single type of environment?
Well, I think it puts human flexibility and ecological generalism at the heart of our species, at the root of our species, it suggests that Homo sapiens already had an innate ecological flexibility that articulated with our behavioral cognitive modernity. That meant that we were always able to exploit a wide range of environments, and that sort of idea that we had to progress to that point is something that happened already before we became Homo sapiens, and by the time we developed into us, we already had those capacities. This isn't something that we had to, in a sense, learn how to become. And this, to me, raises like a third pillar almost to how we think about human origin. So we talk about skeletal morphological modernity, and we talk about cognitive modernity, but to me there's an ecological modernity that's part of the human story as well. And that's not just kind of how we were able to move and exploit into different environments, but what the feedbacks were of the human presence on those environments, and then in turn feedbacks on human society. So it's almost like a whole sort of ecological modernity story that we're only just starting to understand now, that I think is a really exciting new area of research.
So you have another recent paper on hunter-gatherers on remote Mediterranean islands, namely Malta. Tell us about that. First of all, what did people assume about the peopling of Malta?
Yeah, so I think when we look at niche expansion in Africa and how we were able to move into different habitats and then moving beyond Africa, I think one of the last, I guess, niches for humans to be able to live in and adapt to is the sea. It's a sort of a maritime niche. And understanding, I think, when that happened is a really important question too. So, we know people got to Australia, we know they got to the Ryukyu Islands of Japan, but we don't know the degree to which that sort of sustained seafaring happened. That sort of sustained elements seem to happen maybe like a little bit later, in a way that we can really see humans sort of conquering a maritime niche, even though we know that sort of earlier seafaring did happen. And I think that the islands of Japan are probably the most impressive, because you're looking at something like 110 kilometers, possibly by sea, to get there. And Mediterranean islands in particular are thought to have been these last wildernesses. They're sort of some of the last places people get to are the small and remote islands. People do get to Australia at an earlier stage, but Australia is not a small island. It's a huge place that people could exploit. And of course, when you're looking at the small and remote islands, you're coupling those seafaring capabilities with the capability and ecosystem knowledge to be able to exploit food in such a way that you can survive on a very small landmass. And typically we think of hunter-gatherers needing a much greater area to be able to exploit, particularly on semi-arid islands like the Mediterranean, where you don't have densely packed nutrients in any way, and you have problems with rainfall and water availability. So for humans to be able to survive on small islands as hunter-gatherers, and to be able to cross those bodies of water, speaks to probably the highest levels of capabilities of hunter-gatherers right before the transition to farming. And this is what's very interesting about the Mesolithic period being the last phase of European hunter-gatherers for this part of the world, because we see this greater degree of maritime engagement. We see semi-sedentary behaviors. We see experiments with wild plants in a way that we maybe don't see in preceding periods of hunter-gatherer prehistory. And so for me, this is a question that's sort of the other end of that story. So, we start off somewhere in Africa 300,000 years ago, these multiple different communities across Africa starting to engage with these different habitats, expanding their range of tolerances through their material culture and their human relationships. And at the end of that story, before farming happens, to me is the story of these final hunter-gatherers and their ability to conquer both the maritime niche and live on small islands. But this is not something that they were supposed to have been able to do. And we thought that small and remote islands in the Mediterranean are beyond the capabilities of these hunter-gatherers. For the longest time, we thought hunter-gatherers only get to the big islands that are close to the shore, either because they were unable to get to the small and remote islands, or because it wasn't worth the attempt, because they're too small. And if you run out of food on a small and remote island, then it's very difficult to get back to the mainland. You're risking your life.
Mm-hmm.
So we find hunter-gatherers on the big islands like Cyprus and Sicily, for example. But these islands are all within a day's crossing by sea. And we know from ethnography and also from later hunter-gatherers that usually people avoid being on a canoe at night. It's very dangerous to be at sea at night. Even if you're navigating using the stars, a few clouds obscure your vision and suddenly you don't know where you're going anymore. You have to rely on wave patterns. We don't know if they had that knowledge. And so, the general consensus has been that farmers are the first people to get to small and remote Mediterranean islands. And that's what I thought too, right? And one of the reasons I wanted to work on a small Mediterranean island was to try to understand what a wilderness looked like before humans arrived in it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, with islands, you have a lot more controls as to what that wilderness may have looked like, because, islands like Malta connects to the mainland at certain intervals, and then other times it's an island. So you have these nice parameters you can implement for a study like this. I didn't expect to find hunter-gatherers on Malta. So until we did this work, the first people we thought arrived on Malta were farmers about 7,500 years ago, which is when we know farming starts to spread into the central Mediterranean island region. But instead, we found Mesolithic hunter-gatherers were present at least 1,000 years before the arrival of the first farmers. They were getting out there. And this is a fascinating story, because you have to look at both the land limitations and their ability to cross a stretch of water. The straight line distance between Sicily and Malta is about 90 kilometers, but it's from the closest region of Sicily, the currents that take you to the east. So even in historic times, boats rarely left from there. They would leave further to the west, where the currents were more likely to take them towards Malta, and sort of less effort sailing, paddling, and so on, which would take you to a minimum distance sea journey of about 100 kilometers. But the reality is that is a really conservative estimate. So, for example, recently there was an experimental voyage from Taiwan to the Ryukyu Islands of Japan, and the distance is about 110 kilometers. And these experienced paddlers made an experimental canoe using Upper Paleolithic stone tools. They made paddles, and they went on a dugout canoe to take this journey. And it took them on a journey of about, I can't remember exactly, but it was over 240 kilometers and 2 days at sea. They were exhausted. They ran out of water. Their food went off. It was like a real epic sea journey. And part of the problem was that clouds obscured the stars, so it was difficult to navigate.
Yeah.
And when we see hunter-gatherers on Malta at this time, and their presence over several centuries, has to imply repeated crossings, because it wouldn't have been possible for a small group of people to survive on Malta for 1,000 years without regular sea crossings and connections to Sicily. So they're making this journey repeatedly somehow, which implies that they have an incredible knowledge of the sea. And of course, this is reflected in their subsistence. We find them with fish, with marine mammals. We even found the remains of whales at the site. So these are people who are very comfortable at sea, and had an incredible knowledge of how to cross. And obviously, from Sicily to Malta, it's a very small target, and involves being at sea during hours of darkness.
Mm-hmm.
So it's given us an insight into a Mesolithic world that we didn't know existed. They're getting to these small islands, and of course the question is, where else are they going? And much at the same time that we published our paper, another paper came out showing that some very early farmers in North Africa had great-grandparents who were European hunter-gatherers. And the date of those European hunter-gatherers, their presence is about 8,500 years ago, which is exactly where we find these people on Malta. And so, even from experimental journeys, we can see people are capable of making crossings of even over 200 kilometers in a dugout canoe with difficulty, but they're doing it. Then, we're probably looking at an incredibly connected world of the last hunter-gatherers before farmers arrive. And these people are not just connecting continents, they're connecting small island chains, and they're probably impacting those ecosystems, which are small, fragile ecosystems. So when we think we're looking at the last wildernesses, they're actually not the last wildernesses. By the time the farmers arrive, they're already landscapes that have been modified by humans.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit more about, you've already mentioned some of it, but the kinds of evidence that we can find about for the presence of hunter-gatherers on Malta. I mean, what kinds of remains did you find there?
So the remains that we found are stone tools, which are obviously like ubiquitous. You expect to find the stone tools, and the remains of hearths, fireplaces, and food waste. And in the food waste deposits of this cave, we find a lot of terrestrial animals like deer, endemic red deer, endemic tortoises, even foxes. Lots and lots of birds, so like lots of avifauna, but also a significant seafood component to their diet. Things like crabs, sea urchins, fish, turtles, so marine reptiles as well, seals, whales now. So and it points to like an incredibly diverse diet. And also when we looked at the botanical remains, particularly in the hearths, we can find like wild lentils and native palms, which, in this case were perhaps being used as fuel, but they're also common in sort of basketry, fish traps, things like that. We know these Mesolithic hunter-gatherers are doing these things with palms as well. And so it's pointing to an incredibly diverse diet and the ability to exploit foods like, I don't know, in a small square, we had something like 10,000 edible marine gastropods. So, they're utilizing a lot of nearshore resources as well. And by maintaining this incredibly diverse diet, they're making sure that they're not sort of driving any single group to extinction. And that's a very interesting point to make, because on Malta, we do have these indigenous red deer that we thought had gone extinct already in the Pleistocene. And yet here they are in the Holocene with hunter-gatherers. And because, we had to dig through later farmer archaeology to get to the hunter-gatherers, we actually found out for the first time that these indigenous deer were living in this part of Malta even when the farmers were around. So it actually isn't the hunter-gatherers that are killing off these indigenous deer. And it's amazing that they're coming to Malta for centuries, but managing to conserve the stocks of a small inbred indigenous deer on Malta, to the point that these deer actually survive into later time periods. So, the idea that humans are either part of nature or they turn up and kill everything, probably like both these views are wrong. Humans are capable of modifying their environment, but in a way that also is maybe beneficial for some animals, but not for others. It's kind of a mixed bag. We're still trying to determine their ecosystem impacts, but we can see, they have this very diverse diet. This is how they're able to live on the island, and they're being careful to conserve their resources.
Yeah, there's that very common. I mean, I'm not sure what is the. I mean, I wouldn't even say there's a consensus, but I'm not sure what version of it do people, anthropologists, agree more with nowadays. But there's that idea that because there was a coincidence between the arrival of Homo sapiens on Australia and the Americas and the extinction of megafauna, that they might have probably played a role in that extinction there, right? So, I mean, that came to mind because you mentioned the fact that something like that could have happened also on the islands of the Mediterranean.
Yes, I mean it's extremely possible, and I mean I think what has dominated the debate is that it's climate or it's human overkill, but it's probably likely that you have both these scenarios and you have hybrid scenarios as well. It's probably not a one size fits all.
Right.
It's possible that animals were being already pushed to the edge and humans give them some coup de grace. At least we know that ecosystems on islands are incredibly fragile. They're subject to frequent crashes. And it looks like, the populations on Malta, there may have been repeated crashes and repopulation events from the mainland. So, we have to be careful in how we think about how these things could have happened. One of the surprises from looking at the megafauna of Malta, which is obviously a miniaturized megafauna, you have this, pygmy elephants and giant swans and all these strange animals. We're starting to find out that they didn't all live at the same time, and that some of them went extinct while others persisted. So we don't see a population, we don't see a crash of an entire ecosystem. So we're still starting to piece together that story, but I do think that there will be important lessons for how we approach the megafauna debate generally, because we're able to address it in high resolution from a small space. Like obviously islands don't behave in the same way as mainland ecosystems, so you have to have those important caveats, but also it's much more difficult to investigate these things on big mainland locations, because your data is only as good as what you've got for your extinction date. For all there's a site 20 kilometers away where the same animal existed for another 20,000 years and you don't know. So it can radically change the correlation between extinction dates and human arrivals. It's very difficult to put these things together, but on Malta we have a chance for a really interesting case study.
So what do you think is there more to learn about Homo sapiens across the islands of the Mediterranean and some other possible unknown connections across the wider region?
And I think the importance for the work across the Mediterranean is, we know that Mediterranean islands has this really high concentration of strange endemic island dwarfism, these really strange megafaunas and island endemic species that sort of make these sort of almost like Galapagos archipelagos across the Mediterranean in this sort of very fragile island context, which I think has very important lessons for how we address the current biodiversity and climate crisis. And we know that Mediterranean islands are hotspots in the global climate crisis. They're going to be some of the areas that are going to feel it the hardest. And even within that, Malta is looking down the barrel of a climate gun. And what we can learn about how these ecosystems changed in the past has important implications for how we restore them. So generally, the conversations have been about conserving environments, but we've been talking about conservation without really thinking about what we can restore those environments to, because we never imagined that humans could have been present on these islands and changing them for millennia. So the question of what an original ecosystem looked like on these islands is a question that's wide open, and one that we're trying to understand. And I think once we're able to understand the natural equilibrium of these islands before humans arrived, and then what humans did to either reduce or enhance ecosystem resilience, is a really important question for going into the future. Obviously, it's also a question for understanding these forgotten chapters of human prehistory. What were the connections like in the Mesolithic world? What were these hunter-gatherers doing, these last hunter-gatherers? And I think for a long time, the assumption was, because of our notions of progress, was that, farmers arrived with superior technology, including superior maritime technology somehow, but actually maybe they got that from these Mesolithic seafarers, and maybe they picked up Mesolithic seafaring technology and were able to spread farming using essentially Mesolithic technology. So I think, we're still very much trying to understand this question and how far back these seafaring nurseries go in human history. But certainly I think to answer those questions, the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia are these hotspots because they have these sort of inland sea areas peppered with connected islands. These are the areas in which we're going to be able to understand human engagement with the last great niche, which is the sea.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let me ask you just about one last recent paper of yours where you explore a major expansion in the human niche starting at around 70,000 years ago, which preceded an out of Africa dispersal around 50,000 years ago. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think a major question in paleoanthropology has been, if we dispersed out of Africa multiple times, why are all non-Africans today descended from one group that dispersed out of Africa more or less around 50,000 years ago? Maybe it was a little earlier, maybe about 55. Some people said, no, maybe it's 45, but, around that time. Mm-hmm. Certainly not 130,000 years ago. So why is that? Why were humans not successful or successful enough to leave any detectable trace of their ancestry in non-African populations living today? And one of the things I wondered was, is that an ecology question? Is this a niche question? And I sort of wanted to understand the dynamics of the human niche. So one of the things we decided to do is to model 120,000 years of human niche. And that's a really interesting time period because it encompasses those early dispersals as well as the later dispersals.
Yeah.
And also, from the last 120,000 years, we also have much better climate data compared to previous periods. Obviously, the resolution gets worse and worse the further you go back in time. So we wondered if modeling those niche dynamics could give us some insight into this question. Yeah. And what we see, coupled with the work that we've done in the rainforests of West Africa, is that yes, we see from an early period that humans are exploiting different habitats. We're certainly not confined or trapped into like grasslands. Humans are behaviorally modern, sophisticated creatures that use their material culture and their social connections to be able to expand the range of physical tolerances they're born with. Mm-hmm. And so, it's not like before 70,000 years ago, people are like stuck in a grassland. We know that they're not. But what's interesting is between 120 and 70,000 years ago is that human niche expansion tracks the background niche available to them in Africa. What does that mean? The habitable areas in Africa fluctuate. So areas that are habitable to humans fluctuate. So generally, when you have a combination of climate factors, that means that there's more conducive areas for human habitation in Africa, then you'll see humans expanding into those areas. And during periods when there's environmental downturn, those overall habitable areas in Africa shrink, and human exploitation of different niches shrinks with it. So that's what I mean by like our expansion tracking the background niche in Africa. But we see that decoupling around 70,000 years ago. So generally we see the onset of a glacial period, and the habitable zones of the habitable area open to humans shrinks in Africa, but human niche expansion increases. So, the niche area is going down, but what humans do is, it's going up. So we see this decoupling. Mm-hmm. And suddenly humans are exploiting a much wider range of habitats that are available to them. So it's not like, these areas were not habitable to humans before, but humans were not, for some reason, exploiting them. So humans before 70,000 years ago, yes, they're in rainforests, they're at the edges of deserts, they're in grasslands, But all of a sudden, 70,000 years ago, we're exploiting more types of rainforest, more types of woodlands, more types of grassland, more types of desert edges. You know, there's just like all the various habitat subtypes. Suddenly there's an intensive exploitation of different habitats that we just don't see before, which means humans are expanding their range of tolerances in some way. We don't know exactly how they're doing this, but we imagine it's something to do with their social networks, their cognition, their way of engaging with material culture shifts. And from 70,000 years ago, they expand their niche. They move into different environments, and they start to become the ultimate generalists that we know humans are today. And what we argue is that through this sort of extended montage of humans like moving into different environments, then this gives humans the skills to be able to cope with very different environments that they encounter out of Africa as well. So it's not necessarily specifically, I know how to detoxify this type of plant, because there's a whole host of new plants out of Africa that they wouldn't have encountered before. There's new animals they wouldn't have encountered before. But it's probably something to do with how human groups are able to support each other, how they're able to maintain social networks, how they're able to maintain population level knowledge of the dangers that exist and how to adapt to them, how to test, for example, different plants, and maybe even knowledge about a different range of techniques of how to catch animals, things like traps, for example, use of nets. So it's not just about, you know, these prestige weaponry like spears and bows and arrows and things. There's all sorts of like different ways. So it's likely that, you know, this kind of knowledge starts to become fixed in populations. And of course, when humans expand their niche, they probably also likely encounter the rate at which different groups come into contact with one another and are able to exchange genes, ideas, and maintain social networks. So there is a sort of exponential dimension to this. And so we argue that from 70,000 years ago, we suddenly see humans developing a capacity to live everywhere, which is something that defines humanity today, is that capacity to live everywhere.
And so do you think that this expansion in the human niche at around 70,000 years ago was crucial in terms of how we were able to develop culturally and perhaps in other ways to then be able to move across different environments, including out of Africa?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, first of all, by expanding our niches, we increase the encounter rate between different groups. We can exchange genes and ideas better. And in fact, it's probably no coincidence that the constellation of physical features that defines all contemporary human populations starts to become fixed in single individuals during this time. And we think it also gives us a skill set that we require to successfully disperse beyond Africa and into the Oriental zones, the Palearctic zones, you know, the tundra zones that we know humans then started to encounter and adapt to once they start to move throughout Eurasia. And of course, we know that they do this successfully because all non-Africans today are descended from the group of people who had these skills. And we think that this, at least in part, explains the success of the Out of Africa story around 50,000 years ago, which, you know, maybe before this time didn't make a huge amount of sense, because 50,000 years ago is less environmentally conducive to, say, 125, 130,000 years ago, yet we know human did make it then. And it's because by that time we had already become the ultimate ecological generalists that we are, you know, today. Those roots run deep. We learned how to transcend ecosystem boundaries in the 20,000 years before we successfully left Africa.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, Dr. Scerri, just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
I think my most up-to-date list is available on my website, www.eleanorscerri.com. So that's my name, all lowercase, no dots. There's also links to PDFs, open access So anybody can access this material. They don't have to be stuck behind a paywall. And if it comes across as a little dense, there are also links there to some more digestible SciComm articles which unpack some of these discoveries in a more digestible ways that use a lot less technical language. And really, if you're interested in this sort of great human journey as this story of which how we were able to develop our ecosystem flexibility and adapt to different environments, but shift those environments to our wants and needs, what the feedbacks were, and what that cascading story was down to the very first farmers, then there's about 75 papers on my website on unpacking that story.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show again. It's always a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation and talking about this research.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Kossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Lowacki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers: Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Igni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Giancarlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.